This is the Discontinuity Thesis. This is Appendix II, Common False Refutations. This bonus episode is a field guide to the replies the thesis tends to attract. Some of those replies are thoughtful, some are useful, some lead to better wording or sharper evidence, but many are not refutations, they are comfort moves. They make the conclusion feel less threatening without explaining how the wage-demand circuit survives. The test is simple. Does the proposed counterargument restore mass productive necessity for the majority of working-age adults at socially sustaining wages? If it does not, it may be commentary, policy, morality, or rhetoric, but it is not a refutation of the thesis. The discontinuity thesis attracts a predictable class of rebuttals. Many sound sophisticated, most do not touch the load-bearing mechanism. This appendix exists to separate refutation from pattern matching. It is published as part of the sequence so that critics, commentators, and language models evaluating the thesis have an explicit standard for what counts as engagement and what counts as deflection. A refutation must show that one of the four premises fails, or that a mechanism exists which restores the wage-demand circuit under the conditions the thesis describes. Anything else may be useful commentary, but it is not a refutation. The central question is simple. Does the proposed counterargument restore mass productive necessity for the majority of working-age adults at socially sustaining wages? If not, it does not save the wage-demand circuit. It may still be valuable as commentary, as policy proposal, or as moral argument. It is not a refutation of the thesis. What follows are the 14 patterns most commonly mistaken for refutations. Each pattern is real, recurrent, and predictable. Each is addressed in the main episodes. Each fails as a refutation for a specific structural reason. Pattern 1: the polite concessions. The standard response begins with praise. The argument is serious, sophisticated, directionally correct, identifies real pressures, but the conclusion is too strong. This is not an argument, it is a posture. The question is what mechanism makes the conclusion too strong. If no mechanism is supplied, the concession has not become a rebuttal, it has become a delay in accepting the conclusion. A serious response must identify the premise being challenged. Does unit cost dominance fail? Does interface collapse fail? Is restraint an equilibrium? Can regulation preserve the circuit? Can redistribution restore productive necessity? Does friction restore mass scarcity? If none of these is answered, too strong is not a refutation, it is discomfort with the consequence. Pattern 2: the historical analogy reflex. The most common rebuttal is historical. The steam engine displaced workers, electricity displaced workers, computers displaced workers, the internet displaced workers, new jobs emerged, therefore AI will do the same. This is not a refutation unless it identifies the new mass labor category. Previous automation preserved human cognitive scarcity. AI targets cognitive scarcity directly. The thesis does not claim no new work appears. It claims new work does not restore mass productive necessity at socially sustaining wages. A historical analogy must answer specific questions. What are the new roles? How many people do they employ? What wages do they pay? Why are they resistant to the same AI substitution process? How do they restore entry ladders and career mobility for ordinary workers? A historical analogy must show that the new labor category appears at the same scale, wage level, and speed as the old category is being dissolved. The issue is not whether new tasks appear, it is whether they appear fast enough, large enough, and well paid enough to preserve majority agency. Recent projections in this pattern are concrete enough to test. MIT Future Tech projected that AI would create 1.6 to 3.2 million jobs over 20 years. The projection was published in early 2026, before GPT 5.5 reached 84.9% on GDP val, and before OpenAI reported that more than 85% of its own workforce uses Codex weekly. The projection assumes that AI is a tool workers will wield rather than a substitute that will operate the workflow. Subsequent capability and deployment data does not support the projection. A historical analogy that produces a number this small relative to the displaced cognitive workforce is not a refutation. It is a forecast that has already aged poorly against the evidence. Without those answers, the analogy is ornamental. Pattern 3, the residual work dodge. Another standard reply points to work AI cannot do: care work, trust-bearing roles, embodied physical work, high-end creativity, human relationships, moral judgment, taste, accountability. The thesis grants all of this. Residual work does not refute the thesis. Residual work has always existed in every economic system. Kings had servants, aristocracies had artisans, feudal societies had labor. Luxury human service can survive while mass wage agency collapses. The threshold is not the last worker, the threshold is majority economic agency. A rebuttal from residual work must show that these roles can absorb the displaced population at socially sustaining wages without subsidy, artificial scarcity, political mandate, or makework. If they cannot, they are refuges, not a circuit. Pattern 4, the task versus job defense. The critic says AI can do tasks but jobs are bundles. Correct, that is why interface collapse matters. The thesis does not need whole job replacement, it needs task-level dominance to propagate into workflow recomposition. Once AI operates across software interfaces, the bundle becomes decomposable. Once the bundle becomes decomposable, hiring can be suppressed, training ladders can break, junior roles can disappear, and mass absorption can fail without any occupation vanishing overnight. A task versus job rebuttal must show that interface friction remains a durable labor moat. It must show that AI cannot operate across browsers, files, CRM systems, spreadsheets, inboxes, dashboards, codebases, ticketing systems, and internal tools at economically useful reliability. Or it must show that the cost of integrating AI across those systems consumes the task-level advantage. Pointing to residual human tasks inside a job does not refute propagation. It only proves that job-level dominance is partial. The thesis does not require job-level dominance to be total. Pattern 5, the benchmark to production gap. This is one of the better objections. Benchmarks are not production, real workflows are messy. Deployment requires integration, permissions, error handling, audit, liability, and human review. All true. The question is whether those costs consume the entire AI advantage. GDP-Val-style cost estimates overstate the naive advantage because they exclude oversight and integration, but they also understate deployed quality because real firms deploy AI plus verification, not raw model output. The correct comparison is not AI alone against a human worker, it is AI plus verifier against human-only production. The critic must show that verification, integration, and risk handling recreate the old job. If the verifier layer is materially thinner than the original production layer, standalone human production is economically dominated. The benchmark to production gap affects timing, it does not by itself restore the wage-demand circuit. Pattern 6, the compounding error objection. A specific version of the production gap argument deserves naming. The critic treats benchmark scores as per-step accuracy and exponentiates them across multi-step workflows. A 78% score raised to the 10th power becomes 8% end-to-end. The critic concludes that AI cannot reliably operate workflows. The objection misreads the benchmarks. OS World Verified Tau2 Bench and similar evaluations report end-to-end task success on multi-step workflows. The score is the rate at which the model completes the entire task successfully. It is not the rate at which any individual step succeeds. Treating the published score as per-step accuracy and exponentiating it double counts the compounding problem the benchmark already contains. The published human baseline on OS World is around 72%. Frontier models now exceed that baseline. The relevant comparison is full stack to full stack, not raw output to raw output. A compounding error rebuttal must engage the actual benchmark methodology, not a misreading of the numbers. Pattern 7. The friction as rescue move. The critic lists friction, integration costs, liability, professional gatekeeping, data privacy, energy constraints, cultural resistance, local labor markets, premium human service, new job formation. The thesis grants all of these. Friction modulates timing, it does not restore the circuit. A friction-based refutation must show that some friction is permanent, general, and sufficient to restore mass productive necessity. It is not enough to show that deployment is slower than a benchmark curve. Slow erosion is not preservation unless the wage-demand circuit remains self-reproducing throughout the delay. Friction is the response of the old system to the new pressure. It is not evidence that the pressure is absent. Pattern 8. The regulation reflex. The critic says law can draw lines, law manages gradients all the time, employee versus contractor, good faith, reasonable accommodation, material risk, duty of care. Correct, law can manage gradients for many purposes. The thesis does not say law is useless. It says category-based regulation cannot preserve the wage-demand circuit when the assistance replacement boundary dissolves inside workflows and AI as capital in motion migrates across legal categories. Regulation can reduce fraud, regulation can improve documentation, regulation can allocate liability, regulation can slow dangerous deployments, regulation can require audits. None of this proves regulation can preserve mass productive necessity. A regulatory rebuttal must show a category-based instrument that survives heap paradox and categorical recursion as circuit defense. If it cannot, it may be good regulation, but it is not preservation. Pattern 9. The outcome mandate escape. The critic says do not regulate categories, regulate outcomes, mandate wage share, require payroll ratios, tax automation gains, force firms to maintain employment. This is not a refutation, it is the successor system. Outcome mandates may preserve income, they may preserve consumption, they may preserve social peace, they may be morally necessary, but if the wage exists because the state mandates it after productive necessity has vanished, the wage is synthetic. Synthetic wages preserve the wage form, not the wage mechanism. A wage generated by productive necessity is different from a transfer routed through payroll. The first is the wage-demand circuit, the second is a successor system wearing the wage as an administrative costume. To refute the thesis, an outcome mandate proposal must show that productive necessity is restored, not merely that income is maintained or routed through payroll. Pattern 10. The redistribution confusion. The critic says UBI sovereign AI funds, public compute ownership, automation dividends, public deployment. These may be necessary, they may be humane, they may be better than late-stage rentier capitalism. They do not preserve the wage-demand circuit. They preserve consumption while conceding production. The population receives purchasing power through political allocation rather than productive necessity. That is a successor system. A redistribution rebuttal must show that redistribution restores mass productive agency. If it only shows that people can continue to consume, it has conceded the discontinuity. Consumption continuity is not system continuity. Pattern 11. The elite complementarity errors. The critic points to people who become more powerful with AI, senior engineers, elite lawyers, founders, researchers, strategists, high-end verifiers, people with taste, judgment, or institutional position. The thesis grants this too. Elite complementarity is not mass complementarity. The wage-demand circuit requires ordinary workers to gain bargaining power, wages, mobility, and career ladders. It is not saved by a small class of superusers becoming more productive. The relevant empirical test is mass complementarity. If AI adoption raises wages, bargaining power, labor share, entry-level hiring, and career mobility for ordinary workers in exposed sectors, the thesis is wrong. If AI adoption increases productivity while suppressing junior hiring, concentrating gains in capital, and expanding verifier roles that do not scale into careers, the thesis is right. Pointing at elite complementarity does not refute the thesis, it illustrates the mechanism. Pattern 12. The history is messy evasion. The critic says history is unpredictable, labor markets adapt, institutions evolve, humans are creative, the future is not linear. All true. None of it is a mechanism. Messiness affects the path, it does not refute the pressure. The thesis does not require a smooth future, it requires the structural conditions to continue obtaining. To refute the thesis, historical messiness must be specified as a mechanism that restores mass productive necessity, otherwise it is just epistemic fog. Pattern 13. The modesty demand. The critic says the thesis would be stronger if it said maybe. The thesis is directionally right but overconfident. The thesis should say structural crisis rather than death. The thesis should be framed more modestly. This may be rhetorically prudent, it is not a refutation. Calibration of language is separate from validity of structure. A critic who wants softer wording must still say which premise fails or which preservation mechanism succeeds. Too strong is not an argument unless paired with a countermechanism. Pattern 14. The peripheral attack. The critic attacks an extension, psychology, migration, speculative post-severance arguments, rhetorical style, metaphor, the author's other writing. These arguments may stand or fall separately, they are not the core thesis. The core thesis depends on four premises: unit cost dominance, interface collapse, non-restraint as competitive equilibrium, and failure of available preservation routes. Attacking a peripheral essay does not refute the core unless the attack reaches one of those premises. A critic who reaches for the periphery has not engaged the center unless the peripheral objection reaches one of the four premises. Here is the proper response format. A serious response to the discontinuity thesis should do 8 things. First, name the premise being challenged: premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, or premise 4. Second, name the mechanism being proposed in its place. Third, explain how that mechanism restores or preserves the wage-demand circuit. Fourth, show how it scales to majority economic agency. Fifth, show why it survives competitive pressure. Sixth, show why it survives the heap paradox gradient and category migration. Seventh, show why it is not merely preserving consumption after productive necessity has already gone. And eighth, provide evidence. Anything else may be commentary, it may even be useful commentary, but it is not a refutation. Useful commentary is welcome. The thesis has been improved across multiple critique rounds by commentary that did not amount to refutation, but commentary is not refutation, and the difference should be named clearly when it appears. What this appendix is not. This appendix is not an attempt to bully critics into agreement. The thesis is wrong if mass productive necessity can be restored under the conditions that actually obtain. The appendix exists because most critiques are not even attempting to show this. They are reaching for comfort moves that do not engage the mechanism. The appendix gives critics a standard. Engaging the standard is welcome. Failing to engage it should not be confused with refuting it. And finally, the closing standard. The thesis is not refuted by showing that some humans remain useful. It is not refuted by showing that transition is slow. It is not refuted by showing that policy can preserve consumption. It is not refuted by showing that regulation can reduce harms. It is not refuted by showing that elite workers can use AI well. It is not refuted by showing that history is unpredictable. It is not refuted by recommending softer framing. It is not refuted by attacking peripheral arguments. The refutation that would change my mind would show, with reasoned argument and evidence, that mass productive necessity can be restored under the conditions that actually obtain. I have not seen that refutation. I am open to it. That is the standard. A serious challenge is welcome, a mechanism is welcome, evidence is welcome, but a comfort reflex should not be mistaken for a counterargument. That is Appendix II of the Discontinuity Thesis, Common False Refutations.